difficulties. Fortunately, I guess we're just about 10 minutes late. Welcome to IMC's licensing webinar, Best Practices in Licensing Product Development. I'm Katie Rogers. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, which is hosted by IMC's Vice President of Licensing, Bruce Bridges, and our Product Development and Account Director, Emily Wickerham. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them via the Q&A function on the left-hand side of your screen. Host will try to answer all the questions in the allotted time at the end of the webinar. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Emily to start the program.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us today for the Best Practices in Licensing Product Development webinar. We're excited to have you. Today we're going to discuss best practices in working with licensing partners and going through the product development process. This is key in melding the current practices of licensees with the approval process of the licensors. IMC Licensing has focused on consumer product good brands for the past 13 years, helping guide and facilitate the product development process with our partners. Here are some of the current clients that we are working with. Today we're going to address some of the common and major issues we have found working through the licensing product development process. This is often a roller coaster ride for all parties. Because there's no two deals are exactly the same, there are a lot of ups and downs along the way. However, once the roller coaster ride is over and product is actually on shelf, we all feel exhilarated from the journey and often want to jump back in line to find other ways to partner together and launch new products. Today we're going to cover 3 key areas of working with each other: managing expectations between all parties, tracking everything, and checking in along the way. It's important to note that we will touch on best practices from a licensee perspective and a licensor perspective. Licensing is beneficial for all parties, so it's important to really maximize the benefits and learn how to work together efficiently. One of the biggest problems I have found when working with licensees and licensors is that expectations of each party are not clear. We can get halfway through a product development when a curveball comes flying in, and a lot of times these curveballs can come in from a licensee or a licensor. For example, we can have a licensor say weeks before production is supposed to start, they come in and say, well, you know, we really need to get that plant audit scheduled before you start production. These types of curveballs can really throw a kink into your timeline and your product development plans. So today we're going to go over some best practices to overcome these hurdles. Now I'll take it over to Bruce.
Thanks, Emily. The first one we're going to talk about is reading the contract, which certainly seems a little more than obvious, but a lot of times when we're working with a new licensee, we'll remind them to forward their quality testing results to us so that we can get those before the product is authorized to ship. And sometimes they'll come back to us and say, testing requirements, what are you talking about? So, really what we need to keep in mind is that, a lot of times the people who negotiate the licensing agreements are not the same people that manage the product development of the program. So all parties involved with managing the program really should read the contract at the beginning and make sure that there's clear expectations of what the responsibilities are for each party. So really, the people doing the product development don't always read the contract and really should read the contract before it's signed.
Number 2 is have a kickoff meeting. Having a kickoff meeting is a great way to manage expectations from the beginning. After we've all read the contract, I found it most helpful to get everyone who will be involved in the product development project together. This is most effectively done at a face-to-face meeting and in person, but can also be accomplished over a conference call. This meeting should take longer than an hour and should be scheduled for at least 3 to 4 hours. There are times when we've had kickoff meetings that actually last a whole day. There are a lot of areas to cover during a kickoff meeting, things like quality, marketing, consumer testing, and sales plans. And for the most part, there are key people responsible for these tasks within the different organizations that you're working with. So you can break up your kickoff meeting into different sections and bring in the necessary parties for an hour or so. So only really the people that will be working on the everyday, day-to-day items will need to be in the kickoff meeting for the entire time. Make sure that you have an agenda planned out. All of the items that you would like to cover should be in the agenda. And when the agenda is sent prior to the meeting, it helps people, both parties, understand what will be covered and what they will be expected to cover. Once you're in the kickoff meeting, the agenda, I rarely actually go step by step through the agenda or stay really on timeline tasks to the agenda, but the agenda really serves as a way to check off the things that you want to make sure that you can cover with your parties. The next step is be mindful of licensing guidelines. It's important that there are licensing guidelines spelled out for the expectations of each party. Usually the contract is a great place to start, but not everything is in the contract. When we sign on a new licensee for one of our clients, I typically put together a welcome packet that outlines the things that a licensee needs to be aware of when working with the brands. For example, I'll put in a style guide with the information and packaging artwork. I'll also include a flow chart on how the packaging artwork should be submitted and the timing and expectations for the approvals. I will go through the contract and pull out the key requirements that the licensee should be aware of, things like royalty payments, when royalty payments are due, and who they should be sent to. And the other thing that I also make sure to include is a contact page with roles and responsibilities. I provide this actually to both parties, not just the licensees. This way, if something goes wrong along the way, that you know who you should contact and how to get a hold of them as quickly as possible. No two deals are really ever the same because you're always working with new licensors, new licensees, or a new product. So you need to make sure that you're aware of what is required and expected of your partnership. This is something, for licensees, this is something that you should be provided, and if you are not provided, you should ask for some guidelines to follow. If a licensor does not provide these guidelines to you, I would suggest going through the contract and kind of outlining the key points that you feel are important to note, and then also taking all the information that you've received to date and compiling that, and then you can send it to the licensor and ask them, is this everything that I need to be aware of, or is there anything else that I should be mindful of when working with you? Licensors, if you have guidelines, you should be providing these to the licensee as it helps manage expectations.
Keep in mind that we're viewing this from the perspective of a licensing agency, so there's definitely going to be perspectives from both sides. There's going to be issues that the licensees face that are going to be much different from issues that the licensors face, and really our job is to kind of keep the ball moving and keep things going and try to minimize on the efforts of the brand owners. That leads us into the next slide for point number 4. Don't rush everything. So really anyone who's been involved in developing a licensing program has most likely experienced this phenomena. Not everything can be a fire drill. You only get so many of these, and this kind of goes for both sides, for licensees and licensors. Especially true when you're trying to get a quick approval. It's really better to have this tough love conversation up front with the licensee and the licensor versus doing it after the second or third fire drill in a row. So this kind of goes back to the topic of this entire section, which is managing expectations. So if you can kind of have these conversations up front, it'll really help people, make sure that they're getting the information they need. And everything is a rush. It really lessens the impact of, real emergencies. And I think it'd be helpful to make a special note here kind of to licensors, which is, You really need a system to be in place to provide licensees timely feedback.
Great, thanks, Bruce. It's also important to note that when you operate in a fire drill, there's a higher risk that something can slip through the cracks, and you may actually have to go back and redo something in the end, which can set you back in your timeline and or cost additional funds. The next section that we're going to cover today, after everyone is clear on expectations, we should be mindful of keeping track of everything. Specifically, all the things that we have agreed to in the kickoff meetings and face-to-face meetings. Tracking everything is different for each organization. There are some clients and licensees that have developed their own proprietary system of tracking submissions and approvals. There are other solutions to track everything, such as Dependable Solutions or CTI. You can also use software projects like Microsoft Project or other online systems. While putting everything in writing is number 5 on my list, I would deem this the golden rule of product development. If you only take away one thing from this presentation, it should be to put everything in writing, especially approvals. It's important to recap all meetings, conference calls, and any other form of correspondence. This is one of those things that seems like a huge pain, but will really save you some headache down the road. I can almost guarantee it. I can't tell you how many times I've had a brand owner send over some artwork and or a licensee send over some artwork, and we'll be on a conference call with the brand and we'll be discussing the artwork, and they'll say, that looks good. But a couple weeks later, you go back and try to find the approval on that specific piece, and there's nothing to track it, and there's nothing in writing. A lot of times, if you go back to the brand owner on this specific artwork that you had discussed, we find that they were either looking at the wrong thing or their direction wasn't clear to the licensee. So always go back and recap approvals that you've had during conference calls. Also, when you're putting approval in writing, be very clear on what you're approving. A lot of times I'll attach the artwork to what is being approved just to be clear on what it is that we're moving forward with. Another thing that we've had issues with is when licensors or brand owners will say, this looks good. Looks good may or may not be approval for the artwork. If you're a licensor and you want to approve something and you mean approved, you should say this artwork is approved. If you're a licensee and you're unsure, always ask for clarification. I also find it helpful to use forms for this process, especially when working with packaging artwork. It's important to note that before shipping a product to retail, licensees should have approval to ship in writing from the licensors. Also, things to consider: as a licensing agent, we do not have the authority to approve artwork or any other submissions. While we help facilitate approval and work through this with licensees and licensors, we actually do not have this approval authority. Also, when working with the brands, typically the approval comes from multiple internal parties, so it's not something that can usually be done quickly and has to be reviewed through 3 or 4 people on the brand. And this is where we reference back Bruce's rule number 4, don't rush everything, because it's hard to get all these parties together and really approving artwork in a day.
Right, and I think that's a great point about the feedback from the brand saying that, yeah, that looks great, or yeah, that's approved. I think one more thing we should point out is that when they say that, they may be approving it from the brand equity point of view, but then we also may need legal point of view and other points of view. So we've got to make sure that when the licensee hears it's approved, they understand, to what limit that approval covers. And now I'm going to talk about point number 6, which is understanding quality requirements. Now, this one could certainly be its own webinar in and of itself. This is a really major issue for all brand owners and for manufacturers. The key here is really to know what is required of your products legally. from a legal perspective and from a regulatory perspective. Also, if the licensor is going to require additional quality testing or review, make sure you understand those expectations. And this kind of goes back to the slide about reading the contract to make sure you understand what those expectations are. And then also, I would ask if there are certain procedures that need to be followed. You know, you've probably seen a lot in the news lately about different issues related to quality, such as BPA, which is a chemical that can be in plastic. I know the state of New York just passed a law on Friday banning the use of BPA in all child and infant food and beverage storage containers. So there's really kind of the alphabet soup of QA issues. You've got the CPSC, the FDA, the EPA. But the good news is there are great companies like Bureau Veritas, BVCPS, and Intertek that can really help. And, you know, if you're a licensee, they can really test all your products. And if you're a brand owner, those organizations can also help you develop, you know, a list of materials that you want to make sure are not going to be in your products. That way you make sure you're not in conflict with some of the other QA issues such as Prop 65 in California, or if you're going into international waters in Europe, you've got the new REACH requirements to deal with. So, which is essentially a new community regulation on chemicals and their safe use. Get into food licensing, this is a completely another ball game altogether. You know, you've got your HACCP guidelines, your FDA Bioterrorism Act, and then you've got, you know, some of the new SQF programs which have been involved, which is really the Global Food Safety and Quality Certification Program, which really provides independent certification that the food's quality and management system, you know, complies with all the regulatory requirements. On top of this, most brand owners want to do an audit of the manufacturing facility. So whether it's a food or a non-food product, and sometimes they do it themselves, sometimes they'll use a third party depending on the licensor's available resources or their levels of expertise.
Okay, moving on to number 7, substantiate claims. This is another area that we really have some trouble with when working with licensees and licensors. Again, this goes back to managing expectations. Specifically to licensees, you should make sure that it is clear from the beginning what is necessary to make a claim and substantiate that claims to the brands before you put any claims on your packaging or your product. A lot of times I have licensees who may have had similar products out in the market under private label, and they'll have a claim on their product and have been using it for years, and they'll say, well, no one has ever questioned this. It's been out in the market for 5 years and we've not had any issues. I don't understand why I can't put it on the licensed product. When you put a brand on your products, this changes the game. Brand owners are worried about people refuting claims because it's happened to them, and they're conscious about it and ask you to be conscious about it because they don't want anything to hurt the licensed product or their brand name. So licensees, if you're going to make a claim, you must be able to substantiate with proper documentation. And substantiation for these claims needs to be quantitative data that would hold up in the court of law if it's questioned. So licensors will typically ask for substantiation before they approve packaging. And a lot of times when we ask licensees for this, they'll say, well, I sent the product home with 50 of my employees. We all tested it at home and it works great. And this is not quantitative data that will hold up substantiation for your licensors. So it's best to have a testing facility through either consumer testing to provide these types of substantiation for claims. Also, it's important to touch on licensees should also always have an internal legal team review and sign off on their products before submitting to the licensor for review and approval. Some licensees that we work with do not have internal legal departments that can review the packaging for them. And if this is the case, I would really recommend seeking a third-party legal advice on your packaging before you submit it to your brands for review and approval. Most brand owners have an internal legal team to review their core product packaging, and this is something that they do before putting their products out into market. However, licensees should not depend on a brand team's legal review for the review of the licensed product. Most of the time, a brand's legal team will be reviewing licensed products for trademarks and make sure that you have substantiation for the claims that are on that packaging. In my experience, the part that takes the longest in the review and approval of packaging is the legal review by the brand. And this typically takes the longest 2-week time window that we ask licensors to kind of stay within. So when you submit for legal review by the licensor, you want to make sure that you have the claims and the substantiation that you need to get sign off the first time you submit it. If you wait, a lot of times if you don't have the correct substantiation, this process can drag out from weeks. I've even seen it take months to get final sign off from legal. The next section that we're going to cover along the way is checking in. As I stated back on slide 2 for the kickoff, it's important that you check in along the way. This is not something where you hand over the brand name to be used and the licensee provides you with a final product. Licensing is a collaborative effort and it takes the responsibility of both parties to work together. Number 8 is have a timeline with key dates. This is one of the first things my clients ask for when we start a new licensing project. I can't tell you how many times I've created a detailed timeline with every step accounted for, and we're usually off track on the first week. Because you're merging two parties together and learning how to work with each other and the processes that you have in place internally, it's difficult to follow an exact timeline. I found it best to provide a 30,000-foot view timeline with key dates at the beginning of the process. Again, this goes back to managing expectations. If brand owners know that there are key dates that you as a licensee need to hit, then they will do everything they can to help you hit those dates. It's important to create the high-level timeline with ship dates and category resets, and then you can usually work backwards from there. Building in cushion time is always suggested, and if you're the one creating this timeline, I typically would not tell people that we have this cushion time, as we usually use it. One of our licensees recently had their products held in customs for over a month, which made their products late to retail. And while this was something out of their control, it's best to really have those few weeks that you don't have to worry about if you're going to meet your deadline or not. Always be sure to reference this timeline throughout the product development process so that you know everyone is on the same page and that you're moving along step by step.
Number 9 is about scheduling status calls. And we've really found this use to be an invaluable tool to keep parties, on track and accountable. We've certainly had programs that have done both ways, some with and some without, and I know the ones that have the regularly scheduled calls always seem to go much smoother. During this product development phase, we found it really helpful to check in on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis with licensees. It really depends on where you are in the product development life cycle as far as the frequency of these calls. Sometimes they can be just quick check-ins and only last a few minutes, but it can also be helpful to have these on the calendars when there's a big issue that needs to be discussed with the group. So really, the lesson here is just to check in with all parties on a regular basis, and these regular calls really help to keep people accountable. When you've got a call and you assign follow-ups for each party, when you're on the call the following week, everybody's got to report back on the progress they made on those items. And this level of accountability really seems to help things keep moving because people don't want to come back on the call, not having addressed their assignment.
And the final thing is to have a master checklist. Having a checklist of everything that needs to be completed, it helps you make sure that throughout the process that everything is moving along. And as Bruce stated, you can go through these items in status call. Typically, there are several steps to remember and address and check off during the product development phase. You want to make sure that you're keeping track so nothing slips through the cracks. It's also a great reference point in the future if you're working through other product development launches and licensing programs. You can use this checklist and kind of the timing that you worked through to develop your next timeline. In conclusion, we need to remember that to build a successful partnership, we need to manage expectations, track everything, and check in along the way. And as I'll remind you again about rule number 5, the golden rule is put everything in writing. Thank you for joining us today, and feel free to send any questions that you have through the question chat, and we'll field those as they come in. One of the first questions that came in is, who bears the cost of product testing, and what kind of testing should licensors or licensees be thinking about? Bruce?
As far as the cost of product testing, usually that is borne by the licensees, and they're usually already doing product testing as part of their requirements for, for their key retailers require this testing. The regulations, the regulatory issues, they've got to test to be in compliance with those. So lots of times they're already doing most of the testing anyway, so hopefully this won't be an additional burden on them, but they usually are the ones that are required to pay for the product testing. And as far as what testing, should they be thinking about, that really depends on the category they're in. Every category is completely different. Even within categories like apparel, there's going to be a lot different issues between testing for infant sleepwear versus for an adult t-shirt. So it's very category specific, and it's really going to depend on, the level of scrutiny that category comes under. As far as kind of what's the cost associated with this, the costs are usually all over the place. I mean, I think you can usually assume that, you're going to be paying, a few thousand to multiple thousands of dollars to get this testing done. But again, the licensees are having to do this anyway for the key retailers they're already supplying.
The question that came in is, who pays the cost of factory audits? Bruce?
Factory audits, that really, I think, depends probably on a case-by-case basis. A lot of times the licensors will want to do the factory audits themselves. So I think, again, this is as our VP of Licensing Sales, Todd Donaldson, says, it depends. So if it's a category that the licensor or brand owner knows really well, then they may want to perform the audit themselves. A lot of it's going to depend on the available resources they have to do this or their expertise in the category. If it's a food company and they're licensing an apparel deal, they may not have any expertise in apparel or, say, cosmetics. So in that case, they would probably want to use a third party to go in and audit the facilities. And again, that's usually something that I think typically what I've seen is that the licensors pay for in a particular case.
Next question that's come in is, other than providing sign-off, can I as a client assume I don't need to dedicate my team's resources to product development? That is also, it depends on the product category and the risk level of the product that you're licensing into. Really, the rule of thumb is, yes, we always need brands' involvement to make sure that the licensing deal and product launch is successful. And you want to make sure that your extension and your product equity is upheld. So you definitely want to make sure that you're involved as a licensor and a brand owner when working with licensees. It's not as product development heavy as if the licensor was doing the product launch themselves, but it's definitely beneficial to have their help and input. Next question that's come in, can you typically show licensed products that may not be fully approved to potential retailers?
Emily, this is one where I think every brand owner has a differing opinion on this. So some are comfortable with this, some are not. A lot of times with the clients we've worked with over the years, if as long as the agreement is fully executed and the product development is along the way, the brand owners are okay with the licensee showing products to retailers because they're going to have to be prepared for certain category resets. And usually what we ask them is that if you're going to be showing a product that hasn't gone through the final approval, then you just need to give that caveat when you show it to retailers. So you may say, this is kind of where we are now on the product. We haven't received final approval from the brand owner, but this will give you an idea of what the product is what it's going to work like, what it's going to look like, and what you're going to be seeing, and we'll get you final samples of the product as it's completed.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today on the webinar. We've enjoyed having you. A copy of the presentation will be on IMC's website, and you can go and re-listen to